play the story. But getting back to Infocom, what was interesting about them was their quality writing. It actually had literature qualities. You could read them as books, and many of the works of Infocom were actually sold to people, 30 or older. I think it's a market group that is not catered by many of today's video games. It had a very advanced parser. There were some restrictions, but to a certain extent, you got the feel that it actually understood natural language. And what was the most exciting thing about it is that it had high portability thanks to the so-called Z machine. The Z machine was a purely fictional CPU, a virtual machine, before Java made the term popular. And at that time that Infocom was operating, they closed the business in 1989 and started their business in 1978. There was a problem. There was a huge diversity of home computers at people's homes. Like, some people would have a C64, some people would have an Apple II, Atari computers, whatever. Some of the video game programming companies solved that problem by focusing on one brand of machines, and Infocom thought we could sell more copies if we would just cater to all the system at once. So what they did, they designed that virtual machine, a machine with the only purpose of playing text adventures, and then wrote the story files, which were the actual programs to run on that virtual machines. They wrote that on a Unix workstation, and then the text, the story files could actually run on all of the home computer machines, and they would have to implement the virtual machine only once for every system, and then it would give them an endless supply of story files. Now, if you look at text adventures or interactive fiction from a literary critique standpoint, I think they're highly post-structuralist, and I think people like Foucault or Umberto Eco have described it best. What, even if it's pop culture at its best and it's only video games, it wouldn't have been possible without shaping people's minds before through ideas that came from the post-structural debate. The debate that said discourse or interacting, creating your own fiction, is actually the most important element of a narrative. The idea of the lector and fabula, or the reader in the story itself, that Umberto Eco proposed, or simply the literary tradition of postmodernism with authors like Jorge Borges, James Joyce, Italo Calvino. People got used to reading stories that consisted largely of, the reader making out what the story is itself. And it was necessary first to get people's mind in that direction in order for them to enjoy a genre like interactive fiction, I'd say. So, in summary, even although I think some of the stories in interactive fiction and text adventures are maybe not that high in terms of literary critique, they could not have been possible without the whole postmodernism movement in literature before them. People would simply not have understood what it is like to create your own story through reading it. Now, by 1989, 1990, Infocom closed its doors, and the genre of interactive fiction was dead commercially, actually. A very nice quote I found in The Guardian one day was, interactive fiction is unique in that point, that is the one literary genre that sells even worse than poetry. and graphic adventures like Myst or the Lucasfilm adventures took over. Probably most of you have played things like Monkey Island, something like that, and people didn't seem to be interested in, you know, interacting in a textual world, reading shitloads of pages where a narrative unfolds and so on. People just wanted point and click and lots of graphic effects. In 1993, something remarkable happened. The format of the Z machine was reverse engineered, and shortly after it was reverse engineered, a British professor of mathematics by the name of Graham Nelson published a compiler for that Z machine called Inform. And Inform was a programming language for text adventures or interactive fiction. And it was designed in a way that you would design a new language. So it looked a bit like, you know, Python or a bit like C, with having, you know, semicolons at the end. And for a lot of programmers, it was really good. For, at that point, for the first time, they were able to write their own interactive fiction, write their own text adventures that would run on the classic Z machine. But in 2006, after I think 4 years of work reworking the compiler, something even more remarkable happened. Graham Nelson decided to throw away this computer science style language and go for a radical change. Nowadays, this is how you write interactive fiction in Inform 7. The actual source code of this piece of interactive fiction can be read out as natural language. It starts with the story genre is fairy tale, the story headline is blah blah blah, and you can have includes like use no scoring, the serial comma and American dialect. It comes with an easy to use IDE where you have the documentation on the other side. And you can also browse through the world, see all the objects that you created by just saying so-and-so is such and such. Now, many people might have experiences with languages that claim that they possess natural language, like stuff like AppleScript, and after some point it gets a major pain in the ass, because normally computer programming doesn't work that way. It might look easier, but then after some time you find out it's just, you know, syntactic sugar and really no use for solving computer science problems. But with describing a world and describing how objects interact in that world, it really works amazingly well in Inform 7. So this is an example of how you would write source code in Inform 7. East of the garden is the gazebo, above is the treehouse. With this information, it already creates the rooms and creates the objects and creates the ways to go from one object to the other, from one room to the other. A billiards table is in the gazebo. On it, referring to the billiards table, the compiler knows that, on it is a trophy cup. A starting pistol is in the cup. Now, implicitly, you have created a lot of objects and have told the compiler where they are, how they interact to each other, and what to do with them. And it works extremely well. If you go to the Campsite wiki, I've written a piece of interactive fiction called Reconnaissance at Finefort. You can find it at the Campsite wiki under Propaganda. You can download it and play it and find some of the bugs I left for the reader to discover because I was short on time. And this is actually written with Inform 7. It took me 4 months to write it, but the language was the least of my problems. You know, writing the story in a language which is not my native language was much more harder. And you can actually do computer science stuff, like programming in Form 7. You can say a weight is a kind of value, which is a fancy way of saying this is a variable. 10 kilograms specifies a weight. Everything has a weight. So, you know, this is a member data that is applicable to all objects of that kind, of that class, so to speak. A thing usually has a weight of 1 kilogram. A container has a weight called breaking strain, and so on. So you actually, in natural language, describe something that would be pretty hard to describe in that way using C or C-like language. And I find that for that specific purpose actually easier to use. Now, that's all I wanted to say about interactive fiction from my point of view. I'm also interested in your comments after the talk, but before I will switch over to Nika, who is a novelist. I think she will introduce herself as well.
Okay, this works. Yeah, hello, my name is Nika Bertram. I'm from Cologne and a novelist. It's been some time now, actually, that I've written this game I'm going to show you. But honestly, I don't think so much has changed since then, at least not in the German literary scene, but I'll come back to this later. So what I'm going to present tonight is a making of and the history of our game, and I give you a short game demo, very short because we haven't got so much time, and you can download and play it online. And finally, I'm going to tell you something about my personal experiences I made, with the literature market business, a very strange reaction to that. Well, let's start. First there was the book. A novel written or published in 2001 at Eichborn, and you could say it's about a half-human, half-fictional comic artist who got lost in her own comic world. And because the year I got the publishing contract was 1999, was the new economy craze, I also wanted to do a website, but not a simple boring one. So I thought, well, why not also create a MUD to this story, which I called the Kahuna MUD. It's still alive, it's still up and running. You find it on the website of kahunamodus.de/mud.html. But then, because of Jens, he had told me about those interactive fiction games. And so I sat down and started myself to write a text adventure game. But I have also to admit that this is how far I had gone. It's not very far developed. It's only the start. Finally, then I met another person called Jens Halm, by the name Jens Halm. And he was a specialist for Lingo, the programming language. And he said, he wanted also to do a text adventure with me, but to use Lingo for that. And which is why we finally ended up and decided to build this version of the game, the Kahuna Mode fiction game. As you can see, we wanted to include some graphics, we wanted to extend from the text part, but we had some very vicious ideas for that. So what was the concept and the cunning plans? What we did was, our plan was really a bit weird, because we took with Lingo and Macromedia's director a very high-end multimedia CD-ROM production software where you can do lots of blinking lights and stuff. But we took it to create a text adventure, to have a retro feeling of a text adventure. So for me, as the conceptor or the author of it all, my role was not only to write a screenplay or to act as a director, but it was a bit like having to invent a whole filming technique